Welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Child 44 by Tom Rob Smith. 29 March. Leo sat on the edge of his bed, contemplating how his attempt to relaunch an investigation had instead precipitated a city-wide pogrom. Over the past week, the militia had rounded up 150 homosexuals. Today alone, Leo had arrested 6 men, bringing his count to 20. Some had been taken from their place of work, escorted out in handcuffs, while their colleagues watched. Others had been taken from their homes, their apartments, taken from their families, their wives, pleading, convinced that there must be some mistake, unable to comprehend the charges. Nesterov had reason to be pleased. Quite by chance, he'd found a second undesirable, a suspect he could call murderer without upsetting the social theory. Murder was an aberration. These men were an aberration. It was a perfect fit. He'd been able to announce that they were now instigating the largest murder hunt ever launched by the Vualsk militia. A claim that would have cost him his career if he hadn't been targeting such an unacceptable subgroup. Short of space, offices had been converted into makeshift holding cells and interrogation rooms. Even with these improvised measures, it had been necessary to lock several men in each cell with guards given clear instructions that the men needed to be watched at all times. The cause for concern had been the possibility of spontaneous incidents of sexual deviancy. No one quite knew what they were dealing with, but they were certain that were such sexual activities to take place within the militia headquarters, they would undermine the establishment. It would be an affront to the principles of justice. In addition to this high level of scrutiny, every officer had been timetabled to work 12-hour shifts, with suspects questioned constantly, 24 hours a day. Leo had been obliged to ask the same questions again and again, picking through answers for even the smallest variation. He'd carried out this task like a dull automaton, convinced even before they'd made a single arrest that these men were innocent. Alexander's list had been trolled through name by name. On producing the list, he'd explained that he could create it not because he'd been promiscuous, at least not to the extent of having sexual encounters with 100 or so men. In fact, many of the names on the list were people he'd never even met. His information came from conversations with the 10 or so that he'd had sex with. Each man recounted liaisons with different men, so that added together, it was possible to draw a sexual constellation with each man knowing his place in relation to each other. Leo had listened to this explanation. A hidden world opening up. A hermetically sealed existence constructed within society at large. The integrity of the seals was critical. Alexander had described how men on the list met by chance in routine situations, standing in a food line, buying bread, eating at the same table in a factory canteen. In these everyday surroundings, casual conversation was forbidden. A glance was the most that was allowed, and even that needed to be disguised. These were rules that had come about not by agreement or decree. No one needed to be told them. They arose out of self-preservation. They arose out of self-preservation. As soon as the first wave of arrests had begun, news of a purge must have spread throughout their ranks. The secret meeting places, no longer a secret, were abandoned. But this desperate countermeasure had been to no avail. There was the list. The seals around the world had broken. Nesterov didn't need to catch anyone in a sexual compromising act, seeing their names in print, one after the after. One after the after. And realizing that their ranks had been broken, most of the men succumbed to the pressure of this betrayal. Like U-boats, which had for so long remained unseen under the water surface, suddenly they found all their positions had been given away. As they were forced to the surface, they were presented with a choice. Not much of a choice, but a choice all the same. They could reject the charges of sodomy and face public prosecution, certain conviction, imprisonment, etc. Or they could identify the homosexual among them responsible for this terrible crime, the murder of a young boy. As far as Leo could ascertain, Nesterov seemed to believe that all these men suffered from a sickness of some kind, while some were sick in the mildest sense, plagued by feelings for other men, as a normal person might be racked by persistent headaches. Others were dangerously ill, symptoms which expressed themselves in the need for young boys. This was homosexuality in its most extreme form. The murderer was one such man. When Leo had shown photos of the crime scene, photos of the young boy with his guts cut open, all the suspects had reacted in exactly the same way. They were horrified, or at least they appeared to be. Who could have done such a thing? It wasn't one of them. It wasn't anyone they knew. None of them had any interest in boys. Many of them had children of their own, and so on the answers had gone. Every man was resolute. They knew of no killer amongst them, and they wouldn't protect him if they did. Nesterov had expected a prime suspect within a week. After a week, they had nothing to show for their work except a longer list. More names were added, some merely out of spite. The list had become a brutally effective weapon. Members of the militia were adding the names of their enemies onto it, claiming the person had been mentioned in confession. Once a name was on the list, it was impossible to claim innocence. So the number in custody had grown from 100 to nearly 150 men. Frustrated with the lack of progress, the local MGB had suggested they take over the interrogations, shorthand for the use of torture. To Leo's dismay, Nesterov had agreed. Despite floors flecked with blood, there had been no breakthrough. Nesterov had been left with little choice but to initiate prosecutions against all 150 men, hoping this would make one of them speak. It wasn't enough that they were humiliated and disgraced and tortured. They needed to understand that they would lose their lives. They would, if the judge was so instructed, receive 25 years for political subversion rather than a mere 5 years for sodomy. Their sexuality was considered a crime against the very fabric of the nation. Faced with this prospect, 3 men had cracked and begun pointing the finger. However, none of them had picked the same person. Refusing to accept that his line of investigation was flawed, Nesterov considered himself up against a kind of perverse criminal solidarity. Honor amongst deviants. Exasperated, Leo had approached his superior officer. "These men are innocent." Nesterov had stared at him, puzzled. "All these men are guilty. The question is which one is also guilty of murder." Raiza watched as Leo kicked the heels of his boots together. Dirty chunks of snow fell to the floor. He stared down, unaware that she was in the room. She found his disappointment impossible to bear. He'd believed, sincerely believed, that his investigation stood a chance. He'd pinned his hopes on a fanciful dream of redemption, a final act of justice. It was an idea she'd mocked. It was an idea she'd mocked that night in the forest. But it had been mocked far more cruelly by the turn of events. In the pursuit of justice, he'd unleashed terror. In the pursuit of a killer, 150 men would lose their lives, if not literally, then on every other level. They'd lose their families, their homes. And she realized, seeing her husband's hunched shoulders and drawn face, that he never did anything without believing in it. There was nothing cynical or calculating about him. If this was true, then he must also have believed in their marriage. He must have believed it was built on love. Steadily, all the fantasies he'd created about the state, about their relationship, had been shattered. Raiza was envious of him. Even now, even after everything that had happened, he was still able to hope. He still wanted to believe in something. She stepped forward, sitting beside him on the bed. Tentatively, she took his hand. Surprised, he looked at her but said nothing, accepting the gesture. And together they watched as the snow began to melt. 30 March. Orphanage 80 was a 5-story brick building with faded white lettering painted on the side. Work hard, live long. On the roof there was a long line of chimney stacks. The orphanage had once been a small factory. Dirty rags hung across the barred windows, making it impossible to see inside. Leo knocked on the door. No response. He tried the handle. It was locked. Moving to the windows, he tapped on the glass. The rags were jerked back. The face of a young girl appeared for little more than a second, an apparition of filth, before the rags fell back into place. Leo was accompanied by Moiseyev, a militia officer who Leo had begged as little more than a uniformed thug. After a long wait, the main door opened. An elderly man with a fist full of brass keys stared at the two officers. Seeing their uniforms, his expression changed from irritation to deference. He dropped his head slightly. "What can I do for you?" "We're here about the murdered boy." The main hall of the orphanage had once been the factory floor. All the machinery had been cleared, and it had been converted into a dining room, not by the addition of tables and chairs, for there were none, but by the fact that the entire floor was covered with children sitting cross-legged, pressed up against each other and trying to eat. Every child clutched a wooden bowl filled with what appeared to be a watery cabbage soup. However, it seemed only the eldest children had spoons. The rest either sat waiting for a spoon or drank straight from the bowl. Once a child had finished, they licked the spoon from top to bottom before passing it on to the next child. This was Leo's first experience of a state orphanage. He stepped closer, surveying the room. It was difficult to guess how many children there were. 200. It was difficult to guess how many children there were. 200, 300, aged from 4 to 14. None of the children paid Leo any attention. They were too busy eating or watching their neighbors, waiting for a spoon. No one spoke. All that could be heard was the scraping of bowls and slurping. Leo turned to the elderly man. "Are you the director of this institution?" The director's office was on the first floor, looking out over a factory floor covered with children as though they were being mass-produced. In the office were several teenage boys, older than the children downstairs. They were playing cards on the director's desk. The director clapped his hands. "Continue this in your room, please." The boys stared at Leo and Moiseyev. Leo could only suppose that their irritation came from being told what to do. They had intelligent eyes, experience beyond their years. Without a word, they moved together like a pack of wild dogs, collecting up their cards, their matches used as chips, and filed out. Once they'd left, the director poured himself a drink and gestured for Leo and Moiseyev to take a seat. Moiseyev sat down. Leo remained standing, studying the room. There was a single metal filing cabinet. The bottom drawer had been dented by a kick. The top drawer was partially open, and crumpled documents jutted out at all angles. There was a young boy murdered in the forest. You've heard about this. Some other officers were here showing me photos of the boy, asking if I knew who he was. I'm afraid I don't. But you couldn't say for sure if you were missing any children. The director scratched his ear. There are 4 of us looking after 300 or so children. The children come and go. New ones arrive all the time. You must forgive our failings regarding the paperwork. Do any of the children in this facility resort to prostitution? The older ones do whatever they want. I can't keep tabs on them. Do they get drunk? Yes. Do they prostitute themselves? Quite possibly, although I don't sanction it. I'm not involved in it, and I certainly don't profit from it. My job is to make sure they have somewhere to eat and somewhere to sleep. And considering my resources, I do that very well. Not that I expect any praise. The director showed them upstairs towards the sleeping areas. As they passed the shower room, he commented, "You think that I'm indifferent to the children's welfare? I'm not. I do my best. I make sure they wash once a week. I make sure they're shaved and deloused once a month. I boil all their clothes. I will not have lice in my orphanage. You go to any other orphanage and the children's hair will be alive with them, their eyebrows thick with them. It's disgusting. Not here. Not that they thank me for it. Would it be possible to speak to the children on our own? They might be intimidated by your presence. The director smiled. They won't be intimidated by me. But by all means. He gestured to the flight of stairs. The older ones live on the top floor. It's very much their fiefdom up there. The upstairs bedrooms, tucked under the roof, contained no bed frames, just the occasional thin mattress on the floor. The older children evidently took their lunch at a time which suited them. No doubt they'd already eaten and taken the best of the food. Leo stepped into the first room on the landing. He caught sight of a girl hiding behind the door and saw a glint of metal. She was armed with a knife. Seeing his uniform, she slipped the knife away, the blade disappearing into the folds of her dress. We thought you were the boys. They're not allowed in here. Some 20 girls, at a guess aged between 14 and 16, stared at Leo with hardened faces. Leo's mind was thrown back to his promise to Anatoly Brodsky that the two daughters were safe in the care of a Moscow orphanage. It had been an empty, ignorant assurance. Leo understood that now. Brodsky had been right. Those two girls would have been better on their own, looking after each other. Where do the boys sleep? The older boys, some of whom had been in the director's office, were huddled at the back of their room, waiting, expecting them. Leo entered the room and knelt down, placing an album of photographs on the floor in front of them. I'd like you to look through these photos. Tell me if any of these men have ever approached you, offered you money in return for sexual favors. None of the boys moved or gave any indication that his supposition was correct. You haven't done anything wrong. We need your help. Leo opened the album, slowly turning the pages of photographs. He reached the end. The audience of teenagers had stared at the photos but given no reaction. He turned back through the pages. There was still no reaction from the boys. He was about to shut the album when a boy from the back of the group reached out and touched one of the photos. This man propositioned you? Pay me. He paid you. No, you pay me, and I'll tell you. Leo and Moiseyev clubbed together, offering the boy 3 rubles. The boy flicked through the album, stopped at a page, and pointing to one of the photos. The man looked like that man. So it wasn't this man. No, but similar. Do you know his name? No. Can you tell us anything about him? Pay me. Moiseyev shook his head, refusing to pay any more. We could arrest you for profiteering. Cutting the thread short, Leo took out the last of his money, giving it to the boy. That's all I have. He works at the hospital. Same day. Leo drew his gun. They were on the top floor of apartment building 7. Apartment 14 was at the end of the corridor. They'd been given the address by staff at the hospital. The suspect was off sick and had been for the past week, a length of time which would have meant, if all the MGB officers hadn't been busy with their interrogations, that he would have almost certainly been questioned. It turned out that the beginning of his sickness corresponded with the first wave of arrests against the town's homosexual population. Leo knocked on the door. There was no response. He called out, stating their name and rank. There was no reply. Moiseyev lifted his boot, ready to kick at the lock. The door opened. Seeing the guns pointed at him, Dr. Tyapkin raised his hands and stepped back. Leo barely recognized him. This was the same man who'd helped him with the examination of the girl's body, the prestigious doctor transferred from Moscow. His hair and eyes were wild. He'd lost weight. His clothes were rumpled. Leo had seen men broken by worry. He'd seen how their muscles lost shape and strength, as if they'd been eaten up by fear. Leo pushed the door open with his foot, surveying the apartment. "Are you alone?" "My youngest son's here, but he's asleep." "How old is he?" 4 months. Moiseyev stepped in, smashing the metal butt of his gun against Tyapkin's nose. Tyapkin dropped to his knees, blood running into his cupped hands. Moiseyev ordered Leo, "Search him." Moiseyev began searching the apartment. Leo crouched down, helping Tyapkin to his feet, bringing him into the kitchen, where he sat him down on a chair. "Where's your wife?" "Buying food. She'll be back soon." "The hospital said you were sick." "That's true, in a way. I heard about the arrests. I knew it was only a matter of time before you came to me." "Tell me what happened." "I was mad. There's no other explanation for it. I didn't know his age. He was young, maybe 15 or 16. I didn't want someone who'd talk to me or someone who'd tell anyone else about me. I didn't want to have to meet them again, or see them, or speak to them. I wanted anonymity. I reasoned no one would ever listen to an orphan. His word would count for nothing. I could give him a little money, and that would be the end. I wanted someone invisible. Can you understand?" Having completed a cursory search, Moiseyev re-entered the room and holstered his gun. He grabbed Tyapkin's broken nose, twisting the fractured bone right and left, causing him to scream in pain. "Ah!" A baby awoke in a nearby room and began to cry. "You fuck these boys, then kill them?" Moiseyev let go of Tyapkin's nose. The doctor dropped to the floor, curling up into a ball. It was some time before he could manage to speak. "I didn't have sex with him. I didn't go through with it. I couldn't go through with it. I asked him. I paid him. But I couldn't do it. I walked away." "Get to your feet. We're leaving." "We have to wait till my wife comes back. We can't leave my son alone." "The kid will survive. Get to your feet. At least let me stop the bleeding." Moiseyev nodded. "Leave the bathroom door open." Tyapkin left the kitchen and lurched to the bathroom, leaving a bloody handprint on the door, which remained open as instructed. Moiseyev surveyed the apartment. Leo could tell he was jealous. The doctor had a pleasant home. Tyapkin ran the water in the sink, pressing a towel against his nose and speaking, his back turned to them. "I'm very sorry for what I did, but I never killed anyone. You must believe me. Not because I think my reputation can be salvaged. I know I'm ruined. But someone else murdered that boy. Someone who must be caught." Moiseyev was becoming impatient. "Come on." "I wish you the best of luck." Hearing those words, Leo ran into the room, spinning Tyapkin round. Embedded in his arm was a syringe. Tyapkin's legs went slack. He fell. Leo caught him, laying him down on the floor, pulling the syringe out of his arm. He checked his pulse. Tyapkin was dead. Moiseyev stared down at the body. That makes our job easier. Leo looked up. Tyepkin's wife had returned. She was standing at the entrance to the apartment, holding her family's groceries. 1 April. Alexander closed the ticket office. As far as he was aware, Nesterov had been true to his word. The secret of his sexual activities had been contained. None of the customers glanced at him oddly. None of them whispered about him. His family hadn't shunned him. His mother still loved him. His father still thanked him for his hard work. They were both still proud of him. The price for the status quo had been the names of over 100 men. Men who'd been rounded up while Alexander continued selling tickets, answering passenger queries, and dealing with the day-to-day running of a station. His life had returned to normal. His routine was almost identical. He ate dinner with his parents, took his father to hospital. He cleaned the station, read the papers. However, he no longer went to the movies. In fact, he no longer went into the center of town at all. He was fearful of who he might meet, perhaps a militia officer who would smirk knowingly at him. His world had shrunk. But it had shrunk when he'd given up his dream of being an athlete, and he told himself he'd adjust, just as he'd adjusted before. The truth is that he spent every moment wondering if the men had guessed he'd betrayed them. Maybe they'd been told. The sheer number of arrests meant that they were probably forced into cells with each other. What else would they have spent their time doing except speculate on who'd written the list? It was the first time in their life they no longer had anything to hide. And as he thought about those men, he'd found himself wishing that he could swap his freedom for the public humiliation of one those cells. And as he thought about those men, he'd found himself wishing that he could swap his freedom for the public humiliation of one of those cells. However, he wouldn't be welcome there. He had nowhere, neither this world nor their world. He shut the door to the ticket office, locking it behind him, click, and checking the clock which hung over the concourse. He put the keys into his pocket and walked onto the platform. A couple were waiting for the train. He recognized them by sight, although not by name. They waved to him, and he waved back, walking to the end of the platform, watching as the train approached. This train was on time. Alexander stepped off the platform and positioned himself across one of the tracks, staring up at the night sky. He hoped his parents would believe the note he'd left behind. In the note, he'd explained that he'd never been able to recover from the disappointment of failing to become a long-distance runner. And he'd never forgiven himself for letting his father down. Same day. Nesterov had spent the last 4 years promising his family a better place to live. A promise that until recently he used to repeat regularly. He no longer believed that they would be designated a better residence. No longer believed if he worked hard, if his wife worked hard, their labor would be translated into material benefit. They lived on Kropotkinsky Street, on the outskirts of town, close to the lumber mills. The houses on this street had been built haphazardly. All of them were different shapes and sizes. Nesterov spent much of his free time making home improvements. He was a competent carpenter and had replaced the window frames, the doors. But over the years the foundations had sunk, and the front of the house was now tilting forward, slanting at an angle so that the door could only open so far before it became wedged into the ground. Some years ago he'd built a small extension which he used as a workshop. He and his wife, Inessa, crafted tables and chairs and fixed up the house, making whatever they needed. They did this not just for their own family, but for any of the families on the street. All a person had to do was bring them the raw materials and perhaps, as a gesture, some item of food or drink. Yet, in the end, no amount of tinkering could compensate for the property's shortcomings. There was no running water. The nearest well was a 10-minute walk. There was no plumbing. There was a pit toilet at the back of the house. When they moved in, the pit toilet was filthy and falling apart. It had been far too shallow, and it was impossible to go in without gagging at the smell. Nesterov had constructed a new one in a separate location, working through the night to finish. It had decent walls and a much deeper hole with a barrel of sawdust to throw in afterwards. Even so, he was aware that his family lived cut off from the advancements in comfort and hygiene, with no promise of a better future. He was 40 years old. His pay was less than many of the 20-something workers at the car assembly plant. His aspiration to provide a decent home had come to nothing. There was a knock on the front door. It was late. Nesterov, still wearing his uniform, could hear Inessa answer the door. A moment later, she appeared in the kitchen. "It's someone for you. He's from your work. I don't recognize him." Nesterov walked into the hallway. Leo was standing outside. Nesterov turned to his wife. "I'll deal with this." "Will he be coming inside?" "No, this won't take long." Inessa glanced at Leo and then left. Nesterov stepped outside, shutting the door. Fuck. Leo had run all the way here. The news of Alexander's death had wiped out any sense of discretion. He no longer felt the disappointment and melancholy that had racked him all week. He felt unhinged, part of a horrific, absurd charade, a player in a grotesque farce, the naive dreamer, striving for justice but leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. His aspiration that the killer be caught had been answered with bloodshed. Raisa had known all along. She'd known in the forest. She'd known 2 nights ago. She tried to warn him, and yet he pressed on like a child on an adventure. What could one man achieve? He had his reply. The ruin of 200 lives. The suicide of a young man and the death of a doctor. A young man's body cut in 2 by a train. This was the fruit of his labor. This was what he'd risked his life for. This was what he'd risked Raisa's life for. This was his redemption. Alexander is dead. He killed himself, threw himself under a train. Nestorov dropped his head. I'm sorry to hear that. We gave him a chance to sort himself out. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he was too sick. We're responsible for his death. No, he was ill. He was 22 years old. He had a mother and a father, and he liked going to the cinema. And now he's dead. But the good thing is, if we find another dead child, we can just blame it on Alexander. Solve the case in record time. That's enough. What are you doing this for? Because you're not doing it for the money or the perks. Leo stared at Nestorov's lopsided house. Nestorov replied, Tyapkin killed himself because he was guilty. As soon as we started arresting those men, he knew we'd question those children. He knew we'd track him down. He had the surgical skill necessary to cut out a child's stomach. He gave a false testimony to you regarding the girl's murder to confuse us. He was devious, cunning. He told me the truth. That little girl's stomach was cut out. Her mouth was stuffed with bark, just as the boy's stomach was cut out and his mouth was stuffed with bark. She had string tied around her ankle, and so did the boy. They were killed by the same man. And it wasn't Dr. Tyapkin, and it wasn't that teenager Varlam Babinich. Go home. There was a body in Moscow. A young boy called Arkady. Not even 5 years old. I didn't see his body, but I was told that he was found naked, his stomach cut open, his mouth stuffed with dirt. I suspect his mouth was stuffed with bark. Suddenly there's a murdered child in Moscow. That's very convenient, Leo. I don't believe it. I didn't believe it either. I had the grieving family in front of me telling me their son had been murdered, and I didn't believe it. I told them it wasn't true. How many other incidents have been covered up? We have no way of knowing, no way of finding out. Our system is perfectly arranged to allow this man to kill as many times as he likes. And he's going to kill again and again. And we're going to keep arresting the wrong people. Innocent people. People we don't like or people we don't approve of. And he's going to kill again and again. Nestorov didn't trust this man. He'd never trusted him, and he certainly wasn't going to be drawn into making criticisms about the state. He turned his back on Leo, reaching for the front door. Leo grabbed him by the shoulder, turning him so they were face to face again. The intention had been to make another point, to drive home his argument with reasoning and logic. But instead, stumped for words, Leo punched him. It was a good punch. Solid. Nestorov's head cracked to the side. He remained in that position, head to one side. Then, slowly, he turned to face his junior officer. Leo tried to keep his voice steady. We've solved nothing. Nestorov's punch lifted Leo off his feet. He landed on the ground, on his back. It didn't hurt. Not yet. Nestorov stared down at him, touching his own jaw. Go home. Leo got to his feet. We've solved nothing. He threw a punch. Nestorov blocked, throwing one back. Leo ducked. He was a good fighter, trained, skilled, but Nestorov was larger and quick despite his size. Punched in the stomach. Leo doubled up. Nestorov brought a second blow down across the exposed side of his face, dropping him to his knees and splitting open the skin on his cheek. With his vision blurred, Leo toppled forward, falling. He rolled onto his back, gasping. Nestorov stood over him. Go home. In reply, Leo kicked him squarely in the groin. He scuttled back, hunched over. Leo staggered to his feet. "We've solved!" Before he could finish, Nestorov ran forward, crashing into Leo, knocking him into the ground, landing on top of him. He punched him in the stomach, the face, the stomach, the face. Leo lay there, taking blow after blow, unable to get free. Nestorov's knuckles were bloody. Catching his breath, he stopped. Leo wasn't moving. His eyes were closed, a pool of blood collecting in his right eye, fed by a cut to his brow. Nestorov got to his feet, shaking his head at the sight. He moved towards the front door, wiping the blood on his trousers. As he reached for the handle, he heard the sound behind him. Wincing in pain, Leo pulled himself up, unsteady on his feet. He raised his hands as though ready to fight. He rocked from side to side, as if standing on a boat out at sea. He had only a vague idea where Nestorov was. His voice was a whisper. "We've solved nothing." Nestorov watched as Leo swayed. He walked towards him, fists clenched, ready to knock him down. Leo swung a hopeless, pitiful punch. Nestorov sidestepped and caught Leo under the arm just as his legs gave way. Leo sat at the kitchen table. Inessa had warmed some water on the fire. She poured it into a bowl. Nestorov dropped a cloth in the water and Leo was left to clean his face. His lip had been split. His eyebrow was bleeding. The pain in his stomach had subsided. Pressing a finger over his chest and ribs. Nothing felt broken. His right eye was swollen. He couldn't open it. Nonetheless, it was a relatively cheap price for getting Nestorov's attention. Leo wondered if his case would sound any more convincing inside than outside, and if Nestorov could be so dismissive in front of his wife, with their children sleeping in the next door, with their children sleeping in the room next door. "How many children do you have?" Inessa replied. "We have 2 boys. "Do they walk through the woods on their way to school?" "They used to walk that way." "Not anymore." "We make them walk through the town. It takes longer and they complain. I have to walk with them to make sure they don't slip into the forest. On the way back, there's nothing we can do but trust them. We're both at work." "Will they be walking through the forests tomorrow, now the killer has been caught?" Nestorov stood up, pouring tea and putting a glass down in front of Leo. "Would you like something stronger, if you have it?" Nestorov took out a half-empty bottle of vodka, pouring 3 glasses, one for himself, one for his wife, and one for Leo. The alcohol stung the gash on the inside of Leo's mouth. Perhaps that would do it good. Nestorov sat down, refilling Leo's glass. "Why are you in Vualsk?" Leo dropped the bloody cloth into the bowl of water, rinsing it and placing it against his eye. "I'm here to investigate the murder of these children." "That's a lie." Leo had to win this man's trust. Without his help, there was nothing else he could do. "You're right. But there was a murder in Moscow. I wasn't ordered to investigate it. I was ordered to sweep the matter aside. I did my duty in that respect. Where I failed was in refusing to denounce my wife as a spy. I was considered compromised. As a punishment, I was sent here." "So you really are a disgraced officer?" "Yes." "Then why are you doing this?" "Because 3 children have been murdered." "You don't believe Varlam killed Larissa because you're sure that Larissa wasn't this killer's first victim. Am I right?" "Larissa wasn't the first victim. She couldn't have been. He'd done it before. There's a chance the boy in Moscow wasn't the first victim either." Larissa is the first murdered child we've had in this town. That's the truth. I swear it. The killer doesn't live in Vualsk. The murders were by the train station. He travels. He murders children? What kind of man is this? I don't know. But there's a woman in Moscow who's seen him. She saw him with the victim. An eyewitness can describe this man to us. But we need the murder records from every major town, from Sverdlovsk to Leningrad. There are no centralized records. That's why you have to visit each town and collect their case files one by one. You're going to have to persuade them, and if they refuse, you're going to have to talk to the people living there, find out from them. The idea was outlandish. Nestorov should have laughed. He should have arrested Leo. Instead, he asked, "Why would I do that for you? Not for me. You've seen what he does to these children. Do it for the people we live with, our neighbors, the people we sit next to on the train. Do it for the children we don't know and will never meet. I don't have the authority to request those files. I don't know anyone in the militia. You do. You know these men. They trust you. You can get those files. You'll be looking for incidents of murdered children. The cases can be solved or unsolved. There'll be a pattern. Their mouths stuffed with bark and their stomachs missing. Their bodies will probably have been found in public spaces, the woods or rivers, maybe near train stations. They'll have string tied around their ankles. What if I find nothing? If there are 3, which I've stumbled across by chance, there will be more. I'd be taking a great risk. Yes, you would. And you'd have to lie. You couldn't tell anyone the real reason. You couldn't tell any of your officers. You can trust no one. And in return for your bravery, your family might end up in the gulag. And you might end up dead. That is my offer." Leo stretched out his hand across the table. "Will you help me?" Nestorov moved to the window, standing beside his wife. She didn't look at him, swirling the vodka at the bottom of her glass. Would he risk his family, his home, everything he'd worked for? No. Southeastern Rostov, Oblast, west of the town of Gukovo. 2 April. Petya was awake before dawn, sitting on the cold stone steps of their farmhouse. He waited impatiently for sunrise so that he might ask his parents' permission to walk into town. After months of saving, he had enough to buy another stamp, which would bring him to the last page of his album. On his 5th birthday, he'd been given his first set of stamps by his father. He hadn't asked for them, but he'd taken to the hobby. Cautiously at first, and then more and more doggedly until it had become an obsession. Over the past 2 years, he'd collected stamps from other families, working on the Kolkhoz collection farm 12, the farm his parents had been assigned. He'd even struck up casual acquaintances in Gukovo, the nearest town, in the hope of obtaining their stamps. As his collection had grown, he'd bought a cheap paper album in which he stuck the stamps, gluing them in neat rows. He kept this album inside a wooden box which his father had built for him, with the express purpose of protecting it from mishap. Such a box had been necessary since Petya had been unable to sleep at night, constantly checking that water wasn't leaking in through the roof or that rats hadn't eaten the precious pages. And of all the stamps he'd collected, he loved the first 4 that his father had given him the most. Every now and then his parents gave him the occasional kopeck, not a spare kopeck, since he was old enough to realize there was no money to spare. In exchange, he always made sure he did a little extra work around the farm. It took so long to save up that months. It took so long to save up that months went by and all he could do was contemplate which stamps to buy next. Last night, he'd been given another kopeck, the timing of which his mother had considered unwise, not because she was opposed to him buying stamps, but because she knew it meant that there was no chance he'd sleep that night. She'd been right. As the sun began to rise, Petya hurried inside. His mother insisted that he eat a bowl of oatmeal before going anywhere. He ate it as fast as he could, ignoring her concerns that he'd get his stomachache. Finished, he ran out of the house, reaching the track that snaked through the fields on its way towards town. He slowed to a brisk pace. The shops wouldn't be opened yet. He might as well enjoy the anticipation. In Gukovo, the kiosk, which sold stamps and newspapers, was still closed. Petya didn't have a watch. He didn't know when it would open exactly, but he didn't mind waiting. It was exciting being in town, knowing that he had enough money for a new stamp, and he wandered the streets without any particular destination. He stopped by the Elektrishka station, knowing that there was a clock inside. The time was 7:50. A train was due to leave, and he decided to watch it, walking onto the platform and sitting down. He traveled on the Elektrishka before. It was a slow train which stopped at every destination on the way to the city of Rostov. Though he'd only ever been as far as Rostov with his parents, he and some of his school friends occasionally boarded the train for no reason other than they knew they could do so for free. Tickets were rarely checked. He was almost ready to return to the kiosk and buy his stamp when a man sat down beside him. The man was smartly dressed and had a black case, which he put on the ground between his legs as though he was afraid someone might run off with it. Petya looked up at his face. He had thick, square glasses, neat black hair. He was wearing a suit. Petya couldn't tell how old the man was. He wasn't properly old with grey hair. But then again, he wasn't properly young either. He seemed unaware of Petya's presence. Petya was about to stand and leave when quite suddenly the man turned and smiled. "Where are you traveling to today?" "I'm not going anywhere, sir. Not on a train. I'm just sitting here." Petya had been taught to be polite and respectful towards elders. "It's an odd place to be sitting for no reason." "I'm waiting to buy some stamps, but the kiosk isn't open yet. Although it might be open now, I should go and check." Upon hearing this, the man turned his whole body towards Petya. "You collect stamps?" "Yes, sir." I used to be a stamp collector when I was your age. Petya sat back, relaxing. He didn't know anyone else who collected stamps. Did you collect new stamps or used stamps? I collect both. All of mine were new. I bought them from a kiosk, just like you. I wish all mine were new, but they're mostly used. I cut them off old envelopes. Petya reached into his pocket, pulling out his handful of copper kopecks and showing them to the man. I had to save for 3 months. The man glanced at the small heap of coins. Such a long time for not very much. Petya looked down at his coins. The man was right. He didn't have very much. And he realized that he'd never have very much. His excitement was tainted. He'd never have a great collection. Other people would always have more than him. It didn't matter how hard he worked. He could never catch up. His spirits dampened. He wanted to leave and was about to stand when the man asked, "Are you a tidy boy?" "Yes, sir." "Do you look after your stamps?" "I take good care of them. I put them in an album, and my dad has made me a wooden box. That's to keep the album safe. Our roof leaks sometimes, and there are rats sometimes too." "That's sensible to put your album somewhere safe. I did a similar thing when I was your age. I kept mine in a drawer." The man seemed to weigh something up in his mind. "Listen, I have children of my own, 2 young daughters, and neither of them are interested in stamps. They're messy children. As for me, I no longer have time for stamps. I'm busy with my work. You can understand that. I'm sure your parents are also busy." "All the time, sir. They work very hard." "They don't have time to collect stamps, do they?" "No, sir." "I'm in the same situation as them. Here's my idea. I would like my collection to go to a person who'd appreciate it, a person who'd take care of it, a person just like you." Petya considered the prospect of an entire book filled with new stamps. They would date back for as long as this man had been collecting. It would be the collection he'd always dreamed of. He said nothing, unable to believe his luck. "Well, would that interest you?" "Yes, sir. I could put it in my wooden box, and it would be safe." The man didn't seem so sure, shaking his head. "But my book is so full of stamps, it might be too big for your little box." "Then my father will make me another one. He's clever like that, and he wouldn't mind at all. He likes making things. He's skillful." "And you're sure you'd look after the stamps?" "Yes, sir." "Promise me." "I promise, sir." The man smiled. "You've convinced me. You can have it. I only live 3 stops away. Come on, I'll buy you a ticket." Petya was about to say that the ticket was unnecessary, but he swallowed the words. He didn't want to admit to breaking the rules. Until he got the stamps, he needed to maintain this man's good opinion. Sitting on the wooden seats of the elektrishka, staring out of the window at the forests, Petya swung his legs backwards and forwards, his shoes almost touching the floor. There was now the question of whether he should spend his kopecks on a new stamp. It seemed unnecessary, considering all the stamps he was about to acquire, and he decided that he'd return the money to his parents. It would be nice if they could share in his good fortune. The man interrupted his thoughts by tapping him lightly on the shoulder. "We're here." The electrichka had stopped at a station in the middle of the woods, long before the town of Shakheti. Petya was confused. This was a leisure stop for people wanting to get away from the towns. There were paths through the undergrowth, trodden down by walkers. But this wasn't a good time for walking. The snows had only recently melted. The woods were bleak and unwelcoming. Petya turned to his companion, looking at his smart shoes and black case. "You live here?" The man shook his head. "My dacha is here. I can't keep my stamps at home. I'm too worried that my children will find them and touch them with their dirty fingers. But I'm going to have to sell this dacha, you see. So I have nowhere to keep this collection anymore." He got off the train. Petya followed, stepping down onto the platform. No one else had disembarked. The man walked into the woods, Petya just behind. Having a dacha made a kind of sense. Petya didn't know anyone rich enough to have a summer home, but he knew they were often situated in woods or by lakes or by the sea. While walking, the man continued to talk. "Of course, it would have been nice if my children took an interest in stamps, but they just don't care for them." Petya considered telling this man that perhaps his children needed a little time. It had taken him time to become a careful collector, but he was canny enough to understand that it was in his advantage that this man's children were uninterested in stamps. And so he said nothing. The man stepped off the path, walking through the undergrowth with quite some speed. Petya struggled to keep up. The man took long strides. Petya almost had to run. "Sir, what is your name? I'd like to be able to tell my parents the name of the man who gave me the stamps in case they don't believe me." "Don't worry about your parents. I'll write them a note explaining exactly how you came into possession of the album. I'll even give them my address in case they want to check." "Thank you very much, sir." "Call me Andrei." After some time, the man stopped walking and bent down, opening his case. Petya also stopped, looking around for some sign of this dacha. He couldn't see one. Maybe they had a bit further to go. Catching his breath, he stared up at the leafless branches of the tall trees that crisscrossed the grey sky. Andrei stared down at the boy's body. Blood ran down the boy's head, across the side of his face. Andrei knelt, placing a finger on the boy's neck, feeling for a pulse. He was alive. That was good. He rolled the boy onto his back and began undressing him as though he were a doll. He took off the boy's coat, his shirt, then his shoes, and his socks. Finally, he took his trousers and underwear. He gathered the clothes in a bundle, picked up his case, walking away from the child. After about 20 paces, he stopped beside a fallen tree. He dropped the clothes, a small pile of cheap garments. He put his case on the ground, opened it, and pulled out a long piece of coarse string. He returned to the boy, tying one end of the string around his ankle. He made a tight knot, testing it by pulling the boy's leg. It held fast. Walking backwards, he carefully unwound the string as though laying the fuse to a stack of dynamite. He reached the fallen tree, hid behind it, and lay down on the ground. He'd chosen a good spot. The position of the tree meant that when the boy awoke, he'd be out of sight. His eyes followed the line of string from his hand, across the ground, all the way to the boy's ankle. There was still plenty of string left in his hand, plenty of slack. At least another 15 or so paces is worth. Set up, ready, he was so excited he wanted to pee. Afraid he might miss the moment the boy woke up, he rolled onto his side, unbuttoned his flies, and still lying on the ground, emptied himself. Done. He shuffled away from the damp soil, adjusting his position slightly. The boy was still unconscious. Time for the last of the preparations. Andrei took off his glasses, putting them in his glasses case and slipping them into his jacket pocket. Now, looking back, the child was just a blur. Squinting hard, all Andrei could see was an outline, an indistinct splash of pink skin contrasting with the ground. Andrei reached out, snapped a twig off a nearby tree, and began to chew the bark, his teeth turning coarse and brown. Petya opened his eyes, focusing on the grey sky and the branches of leafless trees. His head was sticky with blood. He touched it and looked at his fingers, beginning to cry. He was cold. He was naked. What had happened? Confused, he didn't dare sit up for fear of seeing that man beside him. He was certain the man was close. Right now, all he could see was the sky. But he couldn't stay here, naked on the ground. He wanted to be home with his parents. He loved his parents so much, and he was sure they loved him. His lips trembling, his whole body trembling, he sat up, looking right and left, hardly daring to breathe. He couldn't see the man anywhere. He looked behind him to the side. The man was gone. Petya raised himself into a crouching position, staring into the forests. He was alone, abandoned. He breathed deeply, relieved. He didn't understand, but he didn't want to understand. He peered around for his clothes. They were gone. They weren't important. He jumped and began to run, running as fast as he could, his feet crunching across fallen branches, the soil wet from rain and snow melt. His bare feet, when they weren't crunching branches, made a slapping noise. He wasn't sure if he was running in the right direction. All he knew was that he had to get away. Suddenly, his right foot was pulled back, as though a hand had grabbed his ankle. Unable to keep his balance, he toppled forward, falling to the ground. Without waiting to catch his breath, he rolled onto his back, looking behind him. He couldn't see anyone. He must have tripped, and he was about to stand again when he caught sight of the string tied around his right ankle. His eyes followed its trail into the forests, where he could see it stretching across the ground like a fishing line. The string continued all the way to a fallen tree some 40 paces away. He grabbed the string, trying to pull it down over his ankle and off his foot, but it was so tight it dug into his skin. The string was pulled again, harder this time. Petya was wrenched across the ground, his back covered with mud, before coming to a stop. He looked up. There he was, that man, standing up behind the tree, reeling him in. Petya clutched branches, handfuls of soil, but it was no good. He was being pulled closer and closer. He concentrated on the knot. He couldn't undo it. He couldn't break the string. He had no choice but to tug it down, scraping the skin around his ankle. The string was pulled again, this time sinking into his flesh. He gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. He grabbed a handful of wet mud, lubricating the string. Just as the man pulled again, Petya freed himself from the noose. He leapt to his feet and ran. The string was slack in Andrei's hands. There was nothing at the end of it. He tugged again, feeling his face flush red. He squinted, but the distance was too far. He couldn't see anything. He'd always relied on the string. Should he put his glasses on? No, he'd never had that option as a child. He'd been stuck like this, nearly blind, alone, stumbling through the forests. He's leaving you behind. Andrei jumped up, climbing over the fallen tree. With his nose close to the ground, he followed the stream. Petya ran as fast as he'd ever run before. He'd reach the station. The train would be there. He'd get on and it would move off before the men arrived. He'd survive. I can do it. He turned around. The man was behind him, running, but with his head close to the ground, as though looking for something he dropped. What's more, he was going in the wrong direction. The distance between them was growing. Petya was going to make it. He was going to escape. Reaching the end of the string, the noose, his heart beating fast, Andrei stopped and stared all around, squinting hard. He felt tears forming. He couldn't see him. The boy was gone. Andrei was alone, abandoned. Then, there, to the right, movement. A light color, the color of skin. A boy. Petya checked behind him, hopeful that the distance between them had grown even more. This time he saw the man running very fast and heading in his direction. He was taking long strides, his jacket flapping about his sides. He was smiling wildly. Petya could see that his teeth were, for some reason, completely brown, and he stopped, understanding that there was no escape. Feeling weak, all the blood had left his legs. He raised his arms to his head as if this could protect him, and closed his eyes, imagining himself back in his parents' arms. Andrei collided with the boy at such speed that they both fell to the ground. Andrei was on top, the boy wriggling underneath, scratching and biting his jacket, keeping himself flat on the boy to stop him escaping. Andrei muttered, "It's still alive!" He pulled out the long hunting knife attached to his belt. Closing his eyes, he jabbed the blade underneath him. Cautious jabs at first, stabbing only with the tip. Small stabs, listening to its screams. He waited, savoring this moment, feeling the vibrations of the struggle in his stomach. What a feeling! Excited, the blade went in further and faster until finally the blade went in all the way up to the hilt. At this point, the child was no longer moving.